Hey folks, I'm Happy. I've spent most of my 50 years out in the wild, calling the animals my truest friends. Out here, among the pines, you learn about raw survival and fierce, unconditional love. Today's tale isn't from the woods, but from the cold concrete jungle of LA. It's a powerful story of a desperate father, his sick little boy, and a dusty 1,970 Plymouth Superbird that proved miracles can exist anywhere if you fight hard enough. Where are you tuning in from today? Let me know in the comments below, and please hit that subscribe button for more stories. Chapter 1. The Heavy Price of Hope. The early November wind swept through the concrete canyons of Los Angeles, carrying none of the city's usual postcard warmth. Instead, a damp, intrusive chill rolled off the Pacific, blanketing Sunset Boulevard in a persistent gray drizzle that turned the iconic palm trees into dark, weeping silhouettes against a heavy sky. It was the kind of evening that forced the bustling metropolis to turn inward, its endless sea of red taillights bleeding into the wet asphalt like open wounds. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit walls of the Children's Hospital Los Angeles, the relentless hum of the city was replaced by a far more terrifying sound, the rhythmic, merciless beep of a life support monitor. Garrett Miller stood by the window of room 412, his reflection ghosted against the rain-streaked glass. At 36, he carried the weathered, muscular frame of a man who had spent his youth wrestling with heavy machinery and his recent years fighting an unseen biological enemy. His broad shoulders, which had once stood straight and commanding during his days as a lead mechanical engineer at UCLA, were now visibly bowed under an invisible weight. His hands, thick-fingered and permanently stained with faint lines of engine oil deep within the cuticles, clenched the cold metal sill. He wore a faded flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from decades of turning wrenches, but his face told a story of profound, unmitigated exhaustion. Deep, sorrowful lines were carved around his mouth. His jaw was covered in a thick layer of dark stubble, and his eyes, once a vibrant, inquisitive amber that could diagnose a mechanical failure from across a room, had dulled into the flat color of wet sand. Garrett was a man of quiet precision, a person who believed that every problem had a logical solution if you just looked close enough. But looking at the monitor, logic was failing him. On the narrow bed behind him lay Leo. At just 8 years old, his son looked heartbreakingly small beneath the stark white hospital sheets, surrounded by a complex web of clear plastic tubing and whirring intravenous pumps. Leo had inherited his father's stubborn cowlick of dark hair and his strong nose, but the boy's skin, usually a healthy, sun-kissed tan from weekends spent riding bicycles along the boardwalk in Santa Monica, had turned the translucent, fragile shade of old parchment. A rare, aggressive form of bone marrow failure was systematically draining the boy's vitality, leaving him too weak to lift his head. Every shallow rise and fall of Leo's small chest felt like a ticking clock in the quiet room, a fragile thread that Garrett was desperately trying to hold on to. Beside the bed sat Barnaby, Leo's 3-year-old golden retriever mix. The dog was a scruffy rescue, with a patch of white fur over his left eye and large, floppy ears that usually perked up at the slightest sound of a treats bag opening. Tonight, however, Barnaby was a statue of canine sorrow. He lay perfectly still with his heavy chin resting directly on the cold metal bar of the bed frame, his deep brown, remarkably expressive eyes fixed entirely on Leo's pale, motionless hand. The dog didn't wag his tail, nor did he bark at the passing nurses. He simply emitted a low, occasional whimper from the back of his throat, as if he too understood the immense frailty of the small human he had sworn to protect. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, practiced friction, and Dr. Sarah Jenkins walked into the room, holding a sleek digital tablet like a shield against the world. She was a tall, slender woman in her late 48s, her sharp, elegant features softened by a crown of naturally curly, salt and pepper hair that she kept pinned back with a simple plastic clip. Sarah was known throughout the pediatric oncology wing for her fierce, almost maternal protection of her patients, a trait that had been sharpened into steel after she lost her own younger sister to an unpreventable leukemia decades ago, a tragedy that had driven her away from research and directly to the front lines of patient care. She wore a pale blue lab coat over dark, sensible slacks, her posture remarkably rigid, despite the 16 hours she had already logged that day. Beneath her professional calm, however, her fingers trembled slightly against the edge of the screen. Sarah stepped up beside Garrett, her gaze tracking the rain outside for a brief moment before settling on Leo's pale face. For months, she had admired Garrett's quiet resilience. He was a man who never complained, who understood the technical complexities of Leo's blood cell counts better than most residents, and who always treated the nursing staff with a gentle, old-school chivalry. But tonight, she brought no medical breakthroughs, only the harsh, unyielding reality of a broken financial system. The hospital's administrative board had just issued a brutal, final ultimatum. Leo's emergency bone marrow transplant required a staggering $800,000 to secure the donor tissue and the specialized surgical team. That morning, Garrett's private insurance provider had officially denied the claim, hiding behind a cold wall of bureaucratic legalese that classified the life-saving procedure as experimental under their restrictive policy guidelines. The hospital's chief financial officer, a ruthless man who viewed human lives through the prism of quarterly balance sheets, had given Sarah exactly 24 hours to produce a financial guarantee. If a substantial deposit was not made by the following evening, Leo would be formally transferred to an underfunded, overcrowded state facility across the county, a relocation that Sarah knew, in her professional opinion, would be an absolute death sentence for the fragile boy. Sarah had spent the last 2 hours locked in a heated, whispering argument in the administrative offices, risking her own tenure by deliberately falsifying internal transport delay forms just to buy Garrett a few more precious hours. Her supervisor's words still echoed bitterly in her ears. "We are a specialized hospital, Dr. Jenkins, not a charity house. Empty the bed if they can't pay." She looked at Garrett, her voice dropping to a tight, sorrowful whisper that barely carried over the hum of the heart monitor. "I've managed to lock the transfer files in the system until tomorrow evening, Garrett, but that's the absolute limit of what I can do without getting flagged by audit. If the financial office doesn't see a deposit transaction by 9 o'clock tomorrow night, the transport team will be here to move him." Garrett didn't look away from his son's face. His jaw tightened so hard that a sharp muscle leaped beneath his stubble, his amber eyes narrowing into a dangerous focus. 800,000, he murmured, the massive number tasting like cold ash in his mouth. "I've sold every tool in my shop. I've remortgaged the house twice. There is nothing left in the bank accounts, Sarah. Not even enough to pay for a tank of premium gas." Then, his gaze shifted slowly to the small, laminated photograph tucked into the plastic corner of Leo's heart monitor. It was a picture of a pristine, wildly aggressive vehicle sitting in a sunlit driveway, a 1970 Plymouth Superbird, painted in the vibrant, unmistakable shade of petty blue. The car possessed a massive, towering 3-foot rear wing and an aerodynamic nose cone that made it look more like a spaceship than a traditional muscle car. It was the only inheritance Garrett's father, a legendary local drag racer named Vance Miller, had left behind. It was a numbers-matching legend, a holy grail of American automotive history that Garrett had spent thousands of hours maintaining, swearing he would pass the keys down to Leo on his 16th birthday. To any wealthy collector, it was a multi-$100,000 asset. To Garrett, it was the physical manifestation of his father's memory, the machine that held the laughter of his youth and the dreams of his son's future. Selling it felt like tearing out a piece of his own soul. But as he looked at the bright blue car in the photo, and then at the faint blue tint on his son's fragile fingernails, the choice dissolved instantly. A machine, no matter how rare or legendary, could never outvalue a single breath of his child. The Angel City Auto Elite Auction is holding its premier spring gala in Beverly Hills tonight, Garrett said, his voice completely flat, stripped of all emotion to keep it from breaking under the immense weight of the moment. "The wealthiest collectors in the country are in that room. I'm bringing the Superbird." Sarah closed her eyes, a heavy breath escaping her lips as a wave of profound relief and respect washed over her. She placed a gentle, supportive hand on Garrett's bowed shoulder, her grip tightening. "Go. I will stand guard at this door myself. Nobody touches Leo, and nobody signs a transfer order until you get back with that deposit." Garrett knelt beside the bed, pressing his forehead gently against Leo's limp, warm hand, whispering a silent promise into the boy's palm. Barnaby gave a soft, understanding whine, leaning his heavy head against Garrett's knee. 10 minutes later, the old Ford truck rumbled to life in the dark hospital parking lot, pulling a covered trailer out into the unforgiving Los Angeles rain, heading straight toward the glitz and cold judgments of Beverly Hills. Chapter 2. The scorn of Beverly Hills. The relentless Los Angeles rain that had felt so mournful at the hospital now transformed into a glittering, superficial spectacle as Garrett Miller's rusted 2008 Ford F-250 struggled up the steep, illuminated incline of the Angel City Auto Elite venue in Beverly Hills. The contrast was physically jarring. Surrounding him were pristine avenues lined with towering palm trees wrapped in fairy lights and fleets of immaculate European sports cars idling with quiet, expensive purrs. Garrett's heavy trailer creaked and groaned in protest as he navigated toward the auxiliary unloading bay, a stark, utilitarian concrete dock hidden just out of sight from the main red carpet entrance where the city's wealthiest collectors were gathering for the premier spring auction. As Garrett parked the truck and stepped out into the freezing drizzle, the harsh halogen security lights flooded the flatbed, exposing the 1,970 Plymouth Superbird to the unforgiving glare of the elite world. The legendary machine, which had spent nearly 8 years buried under tarps in a dim, uninsulated garage, while Garrett poured every available cent into Leo's medical bills, looked tragically out of place. The iconic petty blue paint was heavily obscured by a chalky, gray film of accumulated dust and highway grime. The rear driver's side tire was visibly low on pressure, and the chrome accents had oxidized into a dull, neglected matte. Garrett wiped his grease-stained hands on his jeans, clutching the damp registration papers in his fist like a lifeline, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared to unhook the trailer chains, holding on to the desperate hope that someone inside would look past the dirt and see the mechanical masterpiece that could save his son's life. Before Garrett could even reach the heavy iron winch, the frosted glass doors of the loading bay hissed open, and Julian Vance strode out into the damp air, bringing the immediate, suffocating stench of elitism with him. Julian was the venue's senior floor manager, a man of 38 who had meticulously constructed his entire persona to mask his own desperately mediocre origins. He possessed a sharp, almost skeletal jawline, a slicked-back mane of dark hair stiff with expensive pomade, and he wore a custom-tailored, plum-colored Italian silk suit that seemed to actively repel the rainwater. Julian had spent his career curating luxury experiences for eccentric billionaires, developing a venomous disdain for the working class in the process. He was flanked by 2 junior floor assistants, athletic 20-somethings who looked like they had stepped straight out of a country club brochure, sporting matching black blazers and the arrogant, vacuous expressions of legacy hires who had never touched a wrench in their lives. The tallest of the 2, a blond youth named Chad, casually swung a heavy, metal-cased flashlight in his hand, chewing a piece of gum with a slow, insolent rhythm. Julian stopped a few feet from the trailer, refusing to let his polished leather Oxford step into a puddle, his piercing gray eyes sweeping over Garrett's faded flannel shirt, the groaning truck, and finally resting on the dust-covered Superbird with an expression of profound, unfiltered revulsion. "I don't know what kind of backward county fair scrap drive you think you've stumbled into, pal, but the service entrance for the catering staff is around the block, and the local junkyard is miles away in the valley." Julian sneered, his nasal voice cutting through the sound of the rain with practiced cruelty, refusing to even acknowledge the paperwork Garrett was desperately trying to hand him. This gallery is currently hosting the most exclusive automotive elite gala on the West Coast for genuine multi-millionaire collectors. This is not a charity lot where you can dump your abandoned, rotting project car and beg for a handout. Garrett's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck straining as he fought the overwhelming urge to drag Julian across the wet concrete. He forced himself to swallow his pride, reminding himself that anger would not pay for Leo's bone marrow transplant. He tried to speak, to explain the matching numbers on the engine block, but Chad immediately stepped forward, a nasty smirk playing on his lips as he aggressively kicked the Superbird's partially deflated rear tire with the steel toe of his designer boot. "Look at this absolute piece of garbage, Julian. The sidewalls are practically dry-rotted and it smells like a damp basement," Chad laughed, raising his flashlight and pointing it directly into Garrett's eyes. "Hook this rolling tetanus shot back up to your tractor and get off the property right now, buddy. Or I'm calling the city impound to drag it away at your expense before it ruins the background aesthetic of our live television broadcast." Standing just inside the shadows of the security booth, observing the entire hostile exchange, was Arthur Pendleton. At 68 years old, Arthur was the venue's head of physical security, a retired Marine combat veteran whose stooped shoulders and slight, permanent limp from a decades-old shrapnel wound effectively disguised a brilliant tactical mind and a deeply ingrained sense of old-school honor. Arthur possessed a weathered, leathery face, a neat silver mustache, and sharp, fading blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Unlike the soft, pampered managers of the gallery, Arthur had spent his youth rebuilding engines in the motor pools of military bases, and he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of classic American steel. The moment Arthur's eyes locked onto the towering, 3-foot aerodynamic wing and the unmistakable, sloping nose cone piercing through the layers of dust on the trailer, his breath hitched in his throat. He didn't just see a dirty car. He recognized a 426 Hemi Superbird, a mythical unicorn of the automotive world, and looking at the quiet, desperate dignity in Garrett's exhausted eyes, Arthur instantly understood that a profound injustice was unfolding on his watch. Refusing to let Julian destroy this man's last hope, Arthur stepped out of the booth, deliberately leaning heavily on his bad leg to appear slower and more bureaucratic than he actually was, pulling a heavy, waterproof clipboard from his belt and stepping squarely between Chad and the vulnerable side panel of the Plymouth. "Hold on a minute, mister." Vance, the automated logistics system just flagged a delivery anomaly for this specific loading zone, and my manual security protocol dictates that I absolutely must verify every single digit on the chassis identification block before any vehicle can be legally ordered off corporate property, Arthur stated, his gravelly, authoritative voice carrying the unyielding, unarguable weight of military discipline that made even the arrogant Chad take a hesitant step backward. Julian let out an exasperated sigh, throwing his hands up in the rain and launching into a furious, impatient tirade about how security regulations shouldn't apply to obvious trash, demanding Arthur bypass the protocol immediately. Arthur simply ignored him, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his pocket with agonizing slowness, wiping them methodically on his jacket while shining a small penlight onto Garrett's paperwork, intentionally fumbling with the pages to buy the desperate father as much time as possible. While maintaining his facade of an old, confused guard strictly following the rules, Arthur smoothly slipped his left hand into his deep coat pocket, retrieving his encrypted corporate communication device. Using just his thumb, working entirely by memory, the old veteran bypassed the local showroom's communication hub and typed a high-priority, code-red emergency alert directly into the internal executive network of the Sterling Motors Corporation, a message that went straight to the top. Authentic. Numbers matching 1970 Plymouth Superbird, located at West Auxiliary Gate. Local management attempting illegal, hostile expulsion. Immediate executive intervention required before the asset is lost. Chapter 3. The $1 Million Shockwave. The echo of Julian Vance's cruel, mocking laughter was abruptly severed as a pair of piercing, ultra-bright LED headlights sliced through the heavy Beverly Hills downpour, painting the wet asphalt of the auxiliary loading dock in a brilliant, clinical white. A sleek, midnight black luxury limousine bearing the unmistakable custom gold leaf emblem of the Sterling Motors Corporation glided into the courtyard with an almost ghostly silence, its flawless ceramic-coated finish completely impervious to the driving rain. The massive vehicle came to a smooth, authoritative halt mere inches from Garrett Miller's rusted truck bumper, instantly shifting the power dynamic of the entire driveway. Julian's arrogant sneer dissolved into a panicked, sycophantic grin. His posture changed from a predatory stance to a deeply submissive, groveling bow as he adjusted his plum-colored lapels and sprinted toward the limousine's rear door, desperate to present himself as the consummate host to the most powerful man in the automotive world. Before Julian could even reach the polished chrome handle, the heavy door swung open and Arthur Sterling stepped out into the damp night air. Completely bypassing the large umbrella, Julian scrambled to hold over his head. At 72 years old, Arthur Sterling was a living legend, a towering, exceptionally lean billionaire whose silver hair was combed back with a razor-sharp precision that mirrored his unforgiving corporate reputation. His ice-blue eyes, cold and calculating as diamonds, possessed a legendary ability to dissect incompetence in a single glance, an armor forged through decades of high-stakes industrial takeovers, and an uncompromising standard of absolute perfection. Wrapped in a bespoke charcoal cashmere overcoat that draped perfectly past his knees, Sterling carried an aura of quiet, untouchable power that caused the younger floor assistants, Chad and his associate, to instinctively snap to attention their previous bravado vanishing into the freezing mist. Julian began to stammer a frantic, rehearsed apology, his voice pitched high with desperation as he pointed an accusatory finger back at the trailer. "Mr. Sterling, I am profoundly sorry for this eyesore at our auxiliary gate. This vagrant brought a piece of absolute junk onto the property, and I was just having security forcibly remove him and his garbage before the VIP guests could notice." Arthur Sterling did not utter a single syllable in response, nor did he even cast a glance at the shivering manager. Instead, his entire body went rigid as his piercing gaze locked onto the unmistakable, towering 3-foot aerodynamic rear wing rising proudly from the dusty flatbed. Brushing past Julian, as if the man were nothing more than a vapor in the wind, Sterling's long, elegant strides carried him directly toward the grime-covered 1970 Plymouth Superbird. With hands clad in fine black leather gloves that visibly trembled with a rare, suffocating emotion, the billionaire reached out and gently wiped a thick layer of garage dust from the pointed nose cone, revealing the vibrant, pristine shade of petty blue hidden underneath. He unlatched the heavy dual hood pins with an intimate familiarity born of a lifetime spent in design bays, lifting the massive steel top to expose the legendary 426 Hemi engine block resting silently in the neglected bay. Sterling's eyes traced the factory chassis stampings, verifying the immaculate, unaltered numbers-matching sequence that his global network of scouts had failed to locate for over 15 long years, a car his own father had commanded him to find before passing away. Turning slowly to face the stunned gallery staff, his voice cut through the steady drumming of the rain, with the absolute thunder of a king reclaiming his crown as he looked directly into Garrett's hollow, exhausted eyes, and announced to the entire gathering that he was purchasing the automobile immediately, bypassing the auction entirely, for the staggering sum of $1 million. At that exact microsecond, miles away, inside the sterile, hyper-focused atmosphere of room 412 at the Children's Hospital Los Angeles, the fragile illusion of stability shattered into an absolute nightmare. The rhythmic, comforting beep of Leo's vital monitor suddenly fractured into a continuous, high-pitched shriek as the 8-year-old boy's heart rate plunged dangerously low, a sudden and severe, marrow-related respiratory complication, robbing his fragile lungs of oxygen. Dr. Sarah Jenkins sprang into action with a terrifying, protective speed, her maternal instincts instantly taking control as she began shouting sharp, precise medical directives to the emergency resuscitation team. Beside her stood Nurse Eleanor Vance, a 32-year-old pediatric specialist with a soft, round face, tired hazel eyes, and a gentle disposition that usually brought immense comfort to frightened children. Eleanor had chosen pediatric medicine after volunteering at a crowded refugee camp in her youth, an experience that made her deeply empathetic, but prone to severe emotional exhaustion under acute clinical stress. Now, as she pushed the heavy emergency crash cart forward, her fingers slipped against the cold metal, her breathing ragged as she struggled to maintain her composure while handing the vital medication vials to Sarah. "Doctor?" Jenkins adjusted the oxygen flow rate with trembling precision, her eyes darting agonizingly toward the large clock on the wall, knowing with a suffocating certainty that Garrett was running out of time against the hospital's ruthless financial deadline. Sarah placed her fingers against Leo's cold, frail wrist, silently fighting back the tears of frustration as she willed the boy's failing heart to hold on to life for just a few more precious minutes while his father fought for his survival across the city. Back beneath the blazing security lights of the Beverly Hills loading dock, the reality of Arthur Sterling's earth-shattering decree settled over the driveway like a physical weight, leaving Julian Vance and his 2 younger assistants completely paralyzed. Julian's aristocratic face had turned an unnatural, translucent shade of white, the blood draining from his features so completely that his skin resembled old automotive primer, his mouth hanging open in a silent, ridiculous gasp, as his mind desperately tried to process the catastrophic reversal of his fortunes. Chad, the arrogant floor assistant who had so casually and aggressively kicked the Superbird's low-pressure tire moments earlier, stood with his arms dropped limply at his sides, his heavy metal flashlight slipping from his unfeeling fingers and clattering loudly against the wet concrete. The very man they had sirnuk as a worthless peasant, the individual they had threatened with criminal impoundment and attempted to cast out into the dark rain, was now standing face to face with the absolute ruler of their corporate universe. Holding a mechanical masterpiece worth a literal fortune, Garrett Miller stood entirely motionless beside the rusted bumper of his truck, the rain dripping from the brim of his faded cap as his amber eyes locked onto the towering figure of the billionaire. The overwhelming magnitude of the $1 million offer echoed through his mind, not as a symbol of sudden wealth or personal triumph, but as the miraculous, roaring voice of absolute salvation, a golden key that would tear down the financial walls of the hospital and guarantee his son's right to live. Chapter 4. The Dignity of Steel and Soul. Arthur Sterling turned from the dust-shrouded Plymouth Superbird, his long cashmere coat cutting a sharp silhouette through the heavy Beverly Hills mist as he gestured for Garrett Miller to follow him toward the private executive pavilion. Garrett stepped carefully onto the pristine marble floor of the gallery, his heavy steel-toed work boots leaving dark, wet tracks across the limestone. Yet his focus never wavered from the crumpled medical notifications tucked inside his flannel shirt pocket. They entered a quiet, mahogany-paneled VIP suite away from the main auction floor, a room that smelled of expensive leather, tobacco, and high-stakes corporate decisions. Sterling walked over to a massive glass desk, uncapping a heavy silver fountain pen with deliberate, unhurried grace, his ice-blue eyes studying the quiet dignity radiating from the exhausted mechanic standing before him. Joining them in the suite to witness the historic transaction was Evelyn Cross, a 56-year-old senior legal counsel for Sterling Motors, who had managed the billionaire's private acquisitions for over 2 decades. Evelyn was a sharp, fiercely loyal woman with short, impeccably styled, silver blonde hair, piercing hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a reputation for icy professionalism that had been hardened after navigating cutthroat corporate espionage during the auto manufacturing wars of the late 90s. She wore a tailored charcoal wool dress and moved with a silent, measured efficiency, immediately laying out the official bills of sale and registration transfer documents with her long, elegant fingers. As Sterling prepared to sign the historic $1 million check, he looked up at Garrett, his deep, gravelly voice carrying a rare, genuine curiosity that bypassed his usual boardroom coldness. A man doesn't bring a numbers-matching, factory original 1,970 Hemi Superbird to an auxiliary lot in a rainstorm unless he is desperate to sell or desperate to flee. Which is it, Mr. Miller? Garrett looked at the silver pen, then met the billionaire's diamond-sharp gaze without a single trace of fear or submissiveness, his own voice steady but heavy with unshed tears. I'm not here because I want your money, Mr. Sterling, and I'm damn sure not here because I wanted to part with my father's car. My 8-year-old son, Leo, is dying of a bone marrow disease in the pediatric oncology wing across town, and his insurance company just walked away from the bill. The hospital gave me a 24-hour countdown to make a deposit before they forcibly transfer him to a state ward, which the doctors say will kill him. I didn't come here to make a profit. I came here to buy my boy his next breath of air. Arthur Sterling froze, his gloved hand hovering over the pristine parchment paper as the raw, unvarnished honesty of Garrett's words pierced through his clinical executive armor. The billionaire's mind instantly flashed backward to a dark, agonizing winter 40 years ago, a time before his massive empire existed, when he had stood helplessly in a cold Chicago clinic watching his own younger brother succumb to a sudden, aggressive illness because their family lacked the capital to secure an advanced specialist. That profound, unhealed scar of loss, the terrible memory of watching a loved one's light fade while trapped behind a wall of financial bureaucracy, instantly connected Sterling to the desperate father standing before him. Without another word, Sterling pressed the silver fountain pen to the paper, signing his name with a powerful, sweeping flourish before sliding the $1 million check across the mahogany desk into Garrett's calloused hands. "Take it, Mr. Miller," Sterling said, his cold eyes softening with an immense, protective reverence. "Save your boy. The automotive world can wait, but a son cannot." The heavy mahogany doors hissed open, and Arthur Sterling strode back out into the grand, brightly lit main sarn of the exhibition gallery, his presence immediately drawing the terrified attention of Julian Vance and his 2 younger floor assistants. Julian stood trembling near the glass display cases, his slicked-back dark hair now ruined by the damp air, his lavender Tom Ford suit looking ridiculously fragile as he nervously wrung his manicured hands together, desperate to offer a rehearsed, sycophantic explanation to salvage his crumbling career. Before Julian could even utter a single, panicked word of greeting, Sterling halted a few feet away, his towering frame casting a long, oppressive shadow over the cowering manager as his ice-blue eyes narrowed into blades of absolute corporate execution. Chad, the arrogant assistant who had so casually kicked the Superbird's low-pressure tire earlier, stood frozen directly behind his boss, his pale skin completely drained of color as he stared at the floor, his previous bravado entirely shattered. "Do not insult my intelligence by speaking, Julian," Sterling commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried across the entire marble gallery, causing the elite onlookers to stop their conversations in stunned silence. "You and your pathetic sycophants have spent your entire, miserable careers looking at vehicles through the hollow lens of status and vanity, completely blind to the historic artistry and human sacrifice built into the very steel you walk past every single day. You blocked a desperate father at the gate. You ridiculed a mechanical masterpiece that my family has hunted globally for 15 years. And you dared to threaten an honest man with criminal trespassing because his work clothes didn't match your superficial standards." Julian tried to gasp out an apology, but Sterling cut him off with a single, sharp gesture of his gloved hand. "You are terminated from this gallery, from the Sterling Motors network, and from every reputable classic automotive auction house on this coast, permanently. You lack the basic competence required to evaluate a machine, and you utterly lack the human decency required to respect the dignity of a human being. Clear your desk, drop your badges, and get out of my sight before I have security throw you into the rain." Turning away from the completely ruined, speechless ex-manager, Sterling's gaze softened as he looked toward the shadows where Arthur Pendleton, the 68-year-old head of security and Vietnam veteran, stood leaning quietly on his heavy clipboard. The old Marine maintained his rigid, disciplined posture, a faint, knowing glimmer of old-school justice reflecting in his fading blue eyes as he watched the corrupt management team get systematically dismantled. Sterling stepped directly up to the old veteran, placing a firm, respectful hand on his stooped shoulder. "Arthur, your tactical vigilance tonight saved a piece of American automotive history, and more importantly, it preserved the honor of this establishment. As of this exact second, Julian's office belongs to you. You are the new general director of the Angel City Logistics and Floor Operations, with full executive authority over this gallery. Hire yourself an honest team that knows how to treat both steel and men with respect." The old veteran snapped a sharp, quiet salute, his silver mustache twitching with a rare grin as Julian and his assistants shuffled out into the cold, dark night, their arrogant elite world completely shattered. Chapter 5. The Race Against Death and the Appearance of a Miracle. The $1 million check clutched in Garrett Miller's grease-stained hand was a blazing energy that dispelled the bone-chilling cold of Beverly Hills as he dashed out of the VIP room without even saying goodbye to Mr. Sterling or the old security guard, Arthur. The Ford F-250 roared violently in the pouring rain, its wheels gripping the wet asphalt of Wilshire Boulevard as Garrett floored the accelerator, transforming the dilapidated truck into a bullet hurtling through the neon-lit streets of Los Angeles, heading back to the Children's Hospital. The roar of the engine harmonized with the frantic pounding in his chest. Every second now was no longer ordinary time, but a fragile boundary between life and death for little Leo. He sped through intersections, the red lights reflected on the waterlogged windshield like ineffective warnings against the desperate determination of a father holding the key to his son's resurrection. As Garrett rushed through the automatic glass doors of the main lobby of Children's Hospital Los Angeles, the chill from his soaking wet clothes rose into the air, thick with disinfectant and intense tension. At the administrative reception desk, a silent crisis was unfolding as Thomas Albright, the hospital's chief financial officer, a 55-year-old man with a half-bald head, thick glasses, and a stern, gaunt face, strained by budget pressures, held a red file containing Leo's transfer order. Thomas was a man of rigid procedure, his rigid personality shaped by years of dealing with the hospital's bad debts, forcing him to wear a cold mask, though deep down, he felt a pang of guilt every time he signed a transfer order for a child. Standing beside him were two medical escorts, preparing to push a specialized stretcher into the elevator to room 412. Garrett rushed in like a whirlwind, breathless, and slammed the $1 million check signed by billionaire Arthur Sterling onto the marble table, much to the utter astonishment of Thomas and the entire accounting staff. The jarring sound caused Thomas to drop his fountain pen, his glasses nearly falling off his nose as he stared intently at the unbelievable numbers on the intact check. He immediately ordered the cancellation of all transfer procedures and activated the hospital's highest-level emergency system, instructing the board of directors to mobilize the most advanced equipment and leading experts at the moment. In the operating room on the 5th floor, all financial obstacles were completely swept away in less than 10 minutes, paving the way for a medical miracle prepared with unprecedented speed. Dr. Sarah Jenkins stepped through the sterile doors of the negative pressure operating room with an air of unwavering confidence and determination, her tall, slender but sturdy frame concealed by a sterile blue surgical gown. Accompanying her was Dr. Robert Vance, the renowned head of bone marrow transplantation on the West Coast, a 60-year-old specialist with short, silvery hair, sharp gray eyes hidden behind protective goggles, and surgical hands as precise as a perfectly calibrated machine. Dr. Vance was known for his extreme quietness, his reticence, and his focus on cases with success rates below 10%. His absolute composure, honed through thousands of hours facing the open chests of pediatric patients, made him Sarah's greatest source of emotional support in this life-or-death battle. Under the bright surgical lights, Sarah watched Leo's vital signs gradually stabilize thanks to the special medications just released from the high-level storage. She took a deep breath through her mask and began the first injections and incisions with absolute concentration, knowing that behind that door, Garrett had successfully fulfilled his promise. For 6 hours of intense tension in the cold operating room hallway, Garrett sat huddled in a plastic chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the red on-air sign above the operating room door. Beside him, surprisingly, was the silent but steadfast presence of Arthur Sterling, the Supreme Chairman who had quietly driven his limousine from Beverly Hills to the hospital to assist with all the complex administrative paperwork, ensuring no one could cause Garrett any trouble. Mr. Sterling removed his elegant cashmere coat, sat down beside the impoverished mechanic on the hallway bench, placed a trembling but warm hand on Garrett's shoulder, which was shaking with fear, and offered the empathetic comfort of someone who had experienced similar loss in the past. In the stifling atmosphere of waiting, Mr. Sterling turned to Garrett, his deep, respectful voice breaking the silence. Chapter 6. A new chapter of shared horizons. The harsh, unpredictable November storms that had battered Los Angeles weeks ago had completely vanished, giving way to a crisp, beautifully clear California autumn morning that seemed to wash the entire city in a warm, golden clarity. Inside room 412 of the Children's Hospital Los Angeles, the terrifying, rhythmic screaming of medical monitors had finally been replaced by the sweet, unfiltered sound of a child's laughter. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful, breathless night in Beverly Hills, and Leo's emergency bone marrow transplant had concluded in absolute, undeniable success. The 8-year-old boy was now sitting upright on the edge of his bed, no longer a fragile soul buried beneath stark white sheets and clear plastic tubing. His skin, once the translucent and terrifying shade of old parchment, had returned to its healthy, vibrant, sun-kissed tan, and his eyes were bright, with a newfound curiosity as he swinging his small legs back and forth. Garrett Miller stood beside his son, his broad shoulders finally straight and unbowed by the heavy, invisible armor of grief he had carried for so long. Garrett had already signed his official employment contract with the Sterling Motors Corporation, stepping into his role as the Global Technical Director of Luxury Restoration with a secure, high-end salary and a premium healthcare policy that guaranteed his family would never have to face a bureaucratic financial wall again. As they prepared the final discharge papers, the door clicked open with a familiar, soft friction, and Dr. Sarah Jenkins walked into the room accompanied by a new, radiating presence. Walking gracefully beside the tall, slender oncologist was Clara Miller, Garrett's 34-year-old wife and Leo's mother. Clara was a gentle woman with long, chestnut-colored hair tied into a soft braid, deep emerald eyes that carried a profound maternal warmth, and a slender frame that had spent the last 18 months hidden away in a specialized psychiatric facility in Northern California. Clara had succumbed to a severe, debilitating nervous breakdown after the initial shock of Leo's diagnosis, a psychological collapse born from a terrifying feeling of helplessness that had completely fractured her reality. For a long time, the pressure of their failing finances and the looming shadow of mortality had kept her locked behind walls of clinical depression. But the miraculous news of Garrett's triumph and Leo's successful Folthwat had acted as a beacon of light, allowing her cognitive faculties to fully heal and return home. Beside her trotted Barnaby, the 3-year-old golden retriever mix, whose floppy ears were perked up in absolute celebration as he wagged his heavy tail so hard his entire body jiggled, occasionally letting out a joyous bark that echoed down the pediatric corridor. Garrett wrapped his strong arms around his wife and son, a complete family once more, the dark shadows of their past entirely dissolved in the bright morning light. To celebrate his son's official victory over illness, Garrett led Leo down the central elevator bank and out into the sweeping, sunlit parking courtyard of the main hospital plaza, promising the boy a surprise that would make his eyes pop. As the heavy glass automatic doors slid open, Leo froze in his tracks, his breath catching audibly in his throat as his small fingers pointed toward the centerpiece of the courtyard. Resting proudly beneath the shade of 2 massive palm trees was the 1970 Plymouth Superbird, but it was no longer the dust-shrouded, neglected machine that had arrived at the auxiliary loading bay in Beverly Hills. The iconic, legendary vehicle had been returned to its absolute, historical perfection. The vibrant petty blue paint gleamed with a deep, liquid, mirror-like finish that perfectly reflected the bright California sky. The massive 3-foot aerodynamic rear wing stood straight and imposing without a single blemish. The low-pressure rear tire had been replaced with factory-fresh Goodyear rubber, and every inch of chrome work had been meticulously polished until it blazed like liquid silver. Standing beside the driver's side door with a quiet, dignified smile was Arthur Sterling himself, holding a set of polished, original keys in his fine leather gloves. It turned out that the billionaire titan had completely mobilized his top-tier network of elite engineers and master craftsmen, ordering them to work around the clock in a specialized, climate-controlled facility for 3 weeks to restore Garrett's inheritance to a condition that surpassed its original factory assembly line standards. Sterling stepped forward, placing the heavy keys gently into Garrett's hand before patting Leo's dark hair with an immense, protective grandfatherly affection. A promise made between a father and a son is the most sacred piece of machinery in this world, Garrett, Sterling said, his ice-blue eyes softening into a warm amber glow. Consider this a tribute from the Sterling family to your unyielding courage. This treasure belongs to your history, and it is time for it to be driven. A few days later, a highly anticipated, documentary-style television feature produced by a major national broadcast network aired across the United States, titled The Price of American Steel: A Father's Redemption. The cinematic film captured the entire raw, gripping journey of Leo's survival and the miraculous resurrection of the numbers-matching 426 Hemi Superbird, focusing deeply on the stark contrast between superficial status and genuine human dignity. The broadcast swept through the country with an organic, overwhelming velocity, inspiring millions of ordinary citizens and hardening a powerful national message. Never judge the absolute value of a human soul, or a mechanical masterpiece, by the layers of dust and grime it forced to accumulate through the storms of life. The beautiful story concluded on a late Saturday afternoon along the breathtaking, sun-drenched coastal highways of Malibu. The massive Plymouth Superbird roared to life, its low, authoritative V8 engine note singing a perfect, flawless cadence that echoed against the Pacific cliffs. Garrett Miller sat behind the wheel, his strong hands guiding the leather rim with a relaxed, joyful precision, while Clara sat beside him with her hair loose in the ocean breeze, and Bay Leo leaned forward from the pristine vinyl back seat, his face glowing with a triumphant, radiant smile. The blue car surged ahead into the bright, endless golden hour sunlight, leaving the dark rain behind forever, moving together toward a future of complete, unbroken happiness. The greatest lesson this story leaves us is that true value is rarely found on the surface. Just like that dusty old car, the people we meet every day might be carrying incredible worth and heavy burdens that we cannot see. In our daily routines, it is so easy to judge someone by their tired faces or worn-out clothes. But if we slow down and look with empathy, we might witness the purest kind of love and sacrifice. Let this be a gentle reminder for all of us to treat everyone we cross paths with using kindness. We never truly know the silent battles others are fighting for the people they hold dear. If this message brought a little warmth to your day, please share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing these journeys together. May God bless you and your loved ones with abundant health, peace, and the strength to overcome any hardship in your path. If you believe in the boundless power of the love of a family and the quiet miracles of everyday life, please comment Amen below to send a prayer out to all the fathers and mothers fighting for their children.